I'll leave the stage now. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Wilson, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. And thanks to the Columbia Museum of Art for having me here today. So as Wilson said, my name is Stephanie, and I am a biologist. I work at a pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the area of neuroscience. But don't worry, we're not here today for a biology lesson. We're here today to talk about the artist Vincent van Gogh and to ask the question, who, or perhaps more intriguingly, what was this fascinating man who created so many extraordinary and beloved works of art? But before we get into that, though, I want to ask everyone here a favor, because today we're going to look at things from a different point of view. A very different perspective. So I want to ask you all just to take any assumptions that you have or any preconceived notions you may have about even the most simple and commonplace things like what an object is or when your present moment takes place, and just leave those at the door. Because today we are going to look at the world from a totally different perspective. So I want you to really open your minds very wide. I want you to spread your minds as wide as possible, so wide that you might even find that you're thinking outside of your head. And with this new perspective, I hope we will be able to appreciate and enjoy the work and the art and the life of Vincent van Gogh in a new and interesting way, and also perhaps understand our own place in the universe in a new and interesting way, in a way that is maybe a little bit less isolated and more connected to each other. So a moment ago, you heard me say you might find yourself thinking outside of your heads. Now, what does that mean? That sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds like nonsense. After all, we know from thousands of years of thought, particularly in the Western world, that the mind or the person or the thing that we are is somehow located inside our bodies. So as early as 360 BC, Plato said, "The soul is a veritable prisoner, fast bound within his body and cemented thereto, compelled to peer through the bars of its prison, wallowing in utter ignorance." And the job of philosophy is to essay the soul's release and show how utterly deceitful are the senses, whether it be through the eye or the ear or any other organ that we seek to comprehend the truth. So here, Plato is identifying a person or mind, a consciousness, as a soul, an immaterial spirit. And he's located this soul. It's located in the body. But the body is a prison because our senses are deceitful. We can't trust them to understand the outside world or to know anything about what is true. And he also elaborates this idea in his allegory of the cave, where he says the human condition is like we are chained inside a cave. So we're chained to the wall, our heads are fixed so that we can only see the wall in front of us as the prisoners there on the left. And we see on that wall shadows, which are actually created by forms passing by a fire behind us. But because this is all we've ever known and all we've ever seen, we take this to be our reality. And I think this is a pretty bleak way of thinking about the human condition from one of the most important thinkers in the history of the Western world. Because if we are trapped inside our bodies and we can't know the truth, then how can we really ever know each other? On the other hand, though, Plato is saying that the soul is immortal. And so therefore, when the body dies, the soul will go on and it will live forever and it will know truth. And that is obviously a very compelling idea that people really like. And so this idea of the soul as an immortal substance that is separate from the body was carried on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And one of the thinkers who's most famous for this kind of dualistic way of viewing the world is the French philosopher, scientist, and mathematician Rene Descartes, who said, "There is a great difference between mind and body, insomuch as body is by nature always divisible and the mind is entirely indivisible. The mind or soul of a man is entirely different from the body. So Descartes has divided the world into two different aspects. For him, there was the material world, which includes the body and all the objects around us that we're familiar with. And then there's the immaterial world, the world of the soul or the mind, and he often uses those words interchangeably. And this, at his time, this was also the scientific revolution was in full swing, and he was interested in the idea of the human body as a machine. And he had a very interesting way of linking the spiritual aspect of nature with the material aspect. So here's a diagram from his treatise on man, where he's kind of showing the mechanical aspect of man. And so how this works is the nerves are like hollow tubes that connect the sensory organs, for example, in this man's foot here near the fire, with the brain. And so when the fire would affect the foot, when he would feel a burn, movement would occur, and that would pull this tube at the bottom, and it would pull the top of the tube in the brain like a bell on a string and open a little pore in that tube. And this cavity labeled F, from this cavity, animal spirits would flow through, back down through the nerve and into the foot, and the man would pull his foot away. So this was sort of the machine aspect of the human body. But as to how the soul was able to act on this machine, Descartes had a very clever and interesting and specific way of how he envisioned this happening. So here I'm showing a diagram that he made of the brain. So this is how the brain is perceiving an object. Descartes believed that there was a small gland inside the brain, which we now know as the pineal gland he was talking about, which was the seat of the soul. And he said the part of the body in which the soul directly exercises its functions is not the heart at all or the whole of the brain. It is rather the innermost part of the brain, which is a certain very small gland situated in the middle of the brain's substance. So what would happen when a person would look at an arrow here is that the light would fall on the back of the retina, as we know it does, and it would affect those nerve endings in a pattern that represented the arrow. And the nerves would pull again, and the other end of the nerves labeled 2, 4, and 6, this pore would open, and the arrangement, the pattern that represents the arrow would draw the animal spirits from this gland to essentially trace the shape of the arrow on this gland. And this is how the soul communicated with the body. So Descartes' view is a little bit different than Plato's. He sees the soul as acting, somehow joined to the body, coupled to the body or acting on the body, whereas Plato sees the soul as entrapped inside the body. But if we take this dualistic view of man versus spirit, then what we have to say is that this is not a self-portrait of Van Gogh. This is, at best, a painting of the machine on which Van Gogh acted, or at worst, this is a painting of the prison inside which Van Gogh was trapped. But Van Gogh was something else. Van Gogh was an immaterial spirit. And of course, in a literal way, it's hard to paint a portrait of an immaterial thing. And if we try to understand the process by which Van Gogh created art within this dualistic framework of mind, we might say that he was able to achieve what he did simply because he was created with the soul of an artist. At the time of his creation, he was somehow divinely endowed with the gift of artistic genius. And of course, he would be able throughout his lifetime to develop that gift to a greater or lesser extent. But in essence, that was just how he was made. And while this is a very romantic vision of an artist as a gifted genius, mysteriously gifted genius, it doesn't necessarily encourage us to ask questions about other aspects of his life that might have contributed to his success as an artist. For example, the world that he lived in, the experiences that he had, or even the physiology of his body and his brain. But this is only one way of thinking about the mind, and there are many others, which we'll get to some of them today. The one that is perhaps very common today, particularly in the scientific field, is the idea that the mind is identical with the brain. And this, one of the earliest scientists to sort of bring this idea into the world was a physiologist by the name of Johann Mueller, who wrote something called the Doctrine of Specific Nerve Energies. And he said that sensation is not the conduction of a quality or state of external bodies to consciousness, but the conduction of a quality or state of our nerves to consciousness. So what he's saying here is that we experience essentially our own nerves, our own nervous system. The Doctrine of Specific Nerve Energies suggests that for every sensation that we have, whether it's the color red or the tone of F sharp or the coldness of ice, there is a specific nerve that is dedicated to that sensation. So the nerve for red has the red nerve energy and so on. And so the thing about this is that he suggests that the external world doesn't matter. As long as you stimulate that nerve, which contains the specific nerve energy, you will get that sensation. So if you take an electrical stimulus to the red nerve, you're going to experience red. And in this way, we really are identifying all of our experiences with our brain. And the idea is still very common and pervasive in the neuroscience world today. So recently, Francis Crick, no other than the Nobel Prize-winning co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Later in his career, he became interested in neuroscience, and he wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, where he says, you, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons, which is, of course, a reference to Alice in Wonderland. You're nothing but a pack of cards. So this really identifies ourselves with our brain. And even more recently, there's a neuroscientist by the name of David Eagleman at Stanford, but he's a very charismatic and interesting guy, and he has a TV show called The Brain, and he's written several popular books about consciousness. And he says, what if I told you that the world around you with its rich colors, textures, sounds, and scents is an illusion, a show put on for you by your brain? If you could perceive reality as it is, you would be shocked by its colorless, odorless, tasteless silence. Outside your brain, there is just energy and matter. So for David Eagleman, this is what the world looks like. Completely black, completely empty, and all we have is the brain. Now, let's add to this the philosophy of David Chalmers, who says, right now in his TED Talk in 2014, right now you have a movie playing inside your head. It's an amazing movie with 3D, smell, taste, touch, a sense of body, pain, hunger, emotions, memories, and a constant voice-over narrative. At the heart of this movie is you. So that when I came in today, this is what I saw. The world outside me was completely black and dark and empty, colorless, tasteless, odorless. But inside my brain, there was this beautiful, colorful movie. Now, let's just take a second here and think about it. Does this seem right to you? Does it seem to make sense that the world around us is completely dark and empty, but we have this wonderful movie inside our brains? Because, you know, if you look in the brain, what you really see there are cells and neurotransmitters and electrical impulses. But for some reason, people really, really like this idea that we create this universe inside our brain. And they really like the idea that our brain is this very sophisticated machine that creates this movie. So just as in Descartes' time, the body was compared with the technology of his time, such as mechanical clocks and garden fountains that were popular during those days, we still compare our bodies with the technology of our time. So face it, your brain is a computer. And Stephen Hawking, the discoverer of black holes, one of the most renowned physicists of our time, has said they think the brain is like a program in the mind, which is like a computer. So it's theoretically possible to copy the brain onto a computer and so provide a form of life after death. And I think this is really interesting because we've gone from the dualistic notion where the self is identified as an immaterial soul or spirit, and to something at the very opposite extreme where the self is identified in a very materialistic way as matter, as the brain. But at the same time, we've kept two of the most important conclusions. One is that we can't know reality because, either we are deceived by our senses or we are hallucinating this illusion inside our head. And the other is that we have the potential to be immortal. And it's as if, the brain is the new soul. And if we take the view of internalism and neuroscience, we have to say that this is a self-portrait of Van Gogh, and that these neurons could be a self-portrait of Van Gogh. And therefore, if we apply this kind of thinking to Van Gogh's ability to create new art, we might say that it is a result of his brain structure, which is ultimately a result of his genetics. And so in this way, the idea of bringing art into the world, it's almost predetermined. You are predetermined, he was predetermined by his genetics to become an artist. And again, I think this doesn't necessarily encourage us to ask about the other parts of his life, his experiences, for example, that have allowed him to create new art. But I think, one of the reasons perhaps people really love this idea so much is because if it makes us the creators of our own universe, right? Our brain has the power to create the whole world. But it does also isolate us because it's very subjective. Then we are all existing in our own world, and it's very hard to know what someone else's world might be like, right? And the other thing it does is it makes us question our reality, and people are really interested in this idea too. So we see articles like this all the time. Does reality exist without us? Your hallucinating brain, how our minds invent the reality around us. And the reality we see is not the reality that exists. And so some people find this idea really interesting, but for me, it leaves me feeling a little, a little uncomfortable. I'm not sure that I like the idea that I'm hallucinating my reality. And I actually found a quote from David Eagleman, the neuroscientist I showed you earlier, who said that there's nothing outside of your brain but darkness and emptiness. And he says, the same question that excites me, how does the brain construct reality, can also scare the out of me a lot of times. Seeing that it's a construction of the brain, it's kind of awful, I guess, because it makes you feel so alien to everything you've ever known and loved. I'm somehow yoked to my brain in a very strong way. And the question for all of us is, are we yoked to it 100%, or is there some other little bit going on? From the inside, I have an intuition that I'm not just equivalent to my body. I kind of feel like there's something about me that's a little separate from the biology, but I have no evidence for that. So even David Eagleman, this hardcore neuroscientist, has a little bit of doubt about this idea that we're identical with our brain. And there are some thinkers who do have some evidence for the fact that we might be something else. But before we get to those, I want to go back to a 17th century philosopher, John Locke, who said, "Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word: experience. So John Locke is saying that everything we know, everything we can think of, comes from our experience of the external world. He's the philosopher that we associate with the idea of tabula rasa, or blank slate, that we are not born with any innate knowledge. Everything we know through experience. And I'd like to add to his point of view the philosophy of George Berkeley. And this is a whole lot of words here. He says, all bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world have not any subsistence without a mind, that their being is to be perceived or known. As to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their esse is percipi, nor is it possible that they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things that perceive them. And so, like I said, that's a lot of words, but in a nutshell, what he's saying is that to exist is to be perceived by a mind. He's the philosopher that we often associate with the question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And for him, it did make a sound because he believed that God's mind was everywhere, and so God would hear it. But I think the part of his philosophy that I'm especially interested in here is what he says about absolute existence. He says that nothing can exist absolutely without any relation, and he's saying to their being perceived. And I think that there's plenty of evidence in physics that for existence for relative existence rather than absolute existence. And the most familiar one is the concept of relative velocity. So to make this physics lesson a little bit less painful, I've decided to use here a painting of downtown Columbia from the turn of the century. And let's say the trolley car is moving away from the Capitol building at 15 miles per hour. Now, what do we mean when we say that? We mean it's moving at 15 miles per hour relative to the ground. But if the carriage is moving 5 miles per hour towards the Capitol building, and we now ask, what speed is the trolley car moving relative to the carriage? It's moving 20 miles per hour. And relative to the sun, the trolley car is moving 67,000 miles per hour. And the point here is that the trolley car is moving all of these speeds at the same time. They're all equally real. It's just that, it depends what it's relative to. The trolley car doesn't have one speed. It has infinite speeds, depending on what you are measuring its speed relative to. And if we were to take away everything in the universe except the trolley car, could we say it was moving or still relative to what? And just to give one more example, let's talk about gravity. So we often think of the Earth's gravity. The Earth has a certain amount of gravity. Now, if I stand on the Earth will pull on me with a force of about 515 newtons. But in relation to the moon, the Earth pulls on the moon with a force of gravity of 2 times 10 to the 20th newtons. And on Jupiter, which is very, very large, but much, much, much farther away, it pulls on Jupiter with a force of about 2 times 10 to the 18th newtons. If we had just the moon, how could we measure its gravity? In comparison to what? And there's a philosopher by the name of Riccardo Manzotti who says, an object exists because it causes effects on other objects, and it allows other objects to exist by their acting upon it. So what he's saying here is that to exist is to cause an effect. Every object exists relatively to another object. And this holds true in our everyday world as well. And for this, I'm going to use his favorite example, which is the apple. If we had an apple and it was the only thing in the universe, how could we say it existed? Relative to what? We can't measure it with anything. It doesn't cause an effect on anything. How can we say it's there? However, if the apple is sitting on the table, it's now exerting a force on the table, and the table is in return exerting a force on the apple. So we can say that it exists as a mass exerting a force. If our table is a picnic table in a lovely sunny meadow, the apple is now receiving heat from the rays of the sun, and we can say it exists relative to the sun as an object that absorbs heat. If we put a camera there, we can also say that it's an object that reflects light. If we have a radio at our picnic, which is playing music, we can say that the apple exists as an object that absorbs pressure waves. It brings the air into the existence, and the air brings the apple into existence by their relative effects on each other. If the radio is receiving an FM signal, the FM signal is being picked up by the radio, but not by the apple, right? The radio waves are going to go right through the apple. So relative to the radio waves, the apple does not exist. Now, if I'm there at the picnic and I see the apple and it's red and it's round and I pick it up and it has a force of gravity on my hand and it's warm from sitting in the sun, and I take a bite and it's delicious and juicy and I say, it's an apple. So according to Riccardo Manzotti, we are not a body. We are the objects that exist relative to our bodies. So by seeing the apple, I have brought the apple into existence relative to my body as an apple. And that apple, according to this theory, is me. And just to bring this clearly in focus here, I want to ask you all, I've simplified this picture down to the apple and me simplified to a brain. And I just want to ask you all, which looks more like my experience of the apple? The brain or the apple? I think it's pretty clearly the apple. And this applies to all of our perceptions. And Riccardo Manzotti has made a video to show how this holds true. His favorite example here is the sunset. So there he is waving his arms. The sunset is behind him. He says, it's here. He walks down the beach and he says, but it's also here. And he walks a little bit further down the beach. And says, and here too. And so he says the traditional notion of subjectivity as something whose existence is relative to a subject is substituted by that of object relativity as something whose existence is relative to another object, which in our case is the human body. So relative to this fisherman, the sunset is here, to this one here, and to the third one there. According to his theory, objects can only exist relative to other objects, and our bodies and brains are objects, and the world that comes into existence relative to them is identical to what we are. So he takes Locke's to be is to be perceived, and he flips it around. So now, to be perceived is to be. And if we apply this mode of thinking to Vincent van Gogh's painting here, we again say, this is not a self-portrait of Van Gogh. This is a self-portrait. This is a painting of an object that is required to bring Van Gogh into existence. But Van Gogh himself is something else. Van Gogh is identical with the world brought into existence relative to his body. But I don't want to go so far as to say that this particular painting is a self-portrait of Van Gogh, because there's one other element of this theory that we need to look at first, and that's the element of time. So experience takes place in time, and like objects, according to this theory, time is also relative to a body. So there's always some delay between a cause and an effect. So when I see the apple, it takes about 300 or a few hundred milliseconds for the light from the apple to enter my eye, to be turned into electrical signals, and to be processed by my brain. Similar time span when I look at the trees. But when I see the light from the sun, it takes 8 minutes for the light to get to me from the sun. And so there's an 8-minute time delay. If the sun were suddenly to disappear, I wouldn't know it until 8 minutes later. But however, because the sun and the apple and the trees are all causing an effect on my body at the same time, they are all therefore present to me in my present at the same time. But there's no arbitrary limit on the length of this time delay, according to Manzotti's theory. So at nighttime, the moon will take about 1 second to reach my body, but the light from the most distant star will take 16,000 light years to reach my body. And in that time, that star may not even exist anymore, but I'm seeing it now in my present. And so in this way, we're almost actually looking at the past. But no matter when the cause takes place, when it affects my body in the present, it is in my present now, my present moment. And according to Manzotti, this idea holds true as well for memories and dreams. So if I were to lay down here in the tent and close my eyes and remember the apple that I saw earlier today, it would be causing an effect on my body, on my brain at that moment that I was remembering it. So it's also a time-delayed experience. According to his theory, all memories are just delayed perception, just as the perception of the star is a delayed perception. And if I were to fall asleep and start dreaming, now that's when things get really, really interesting, because in my dream, I can take any object that I've experienced at any point during my life and reshuffle it around. So earlier in the day, I saw a red apple and I saw a blue sky. But in my dream, there's nothing to prevent me from seeing a red sky and a blue apple, because those are just different objects, different elements of the experience that I had earlier, and I can now recombine and reshuffle and bring something new into the world in that way. So according to Manzotti, a phenomenon is taken to be present if one can interact with it. No event is intrinsically a past experience. So memories and dreams are just delayed and possibly reshuffled experience. And I think this is one thing that we have to keep in mind when we think about Van Gogh and how he brought into the world so much revolutionary new art. We have to consider all of his experience, all the objects that he was in the world, the people that he knew, the places he lived and worked, the books he read, the paintings that he saw, the food he ate and drank. Every experience was a part of his mind. And in the essay that goes with the catalog for this exhibit, Will South has used this theory, this mind-object identity theory, also called the spread mind, to write a nice analysis of Van Gogh and the notion of genius. And he says, the Vincent van Gogh we know was Van Gogh because his unique body, in combination with the 19th century world he lived in, made him possible. And so therefore, in order to understand how he could bring into the world a painting such as The Starry Night, which seems totally new in its use of color and its expressive feeling, we really need to understand all of the aspects of Van Gogh, all of his life, all of the things that his body brought into existence. And without going into a detailed history of his life, I just want to focus on a few key points. He was born into a religious family. His father was a pastor, and he was very well read in the Bible, and he believed in God, and he believed that God revealed himself through nature. His family was also very immersed in the art world. So at the age of 13, he was given a job at the art trading company Goupil by his uncle Vincent, and he worked at that art firm for the next 7 years in Amsterdam, in Paris, and in London. And during that time, he was exposed to thousands of prints by hundreds of different artists. And each of those experiences each of those pieces of art became a part of his mind. And he studied them and he collected these prints. And his brother, Theo, was also a very important art dealer, and he represented Monet. And when Vincent van Gogh finally decided to devote his life to art, Theo supported him and brought him to Paris, where he lived, and met artists such as Cézanne and Gauguin and Seurat and Toulouse-Lautrec. And all of those experiences became objects that he could reshuffle and reuse, became part of his mind, and became part of the world that he was. So, and also in Will's essay, he does a very nice analysis of the different elements of Van Gogh's world that allowed him to create The Starry Night. And one of the things that he mentions, first of all, is Van Gogh was a fan of Hans Christian Andersen. He loved his stories, and one story in particular was called The Clog of Fortune, about a man who dreams of flying to the sky and jumping between the stars. And so Van Gogh would have been aware of this theme. And Van Gogh also, when he came to Paris, he was very well versed in all of the colors and palettes of the Impressionists, including Monet as well as many others. He was interested in color theory and experimented with the pointillistic style of Seurat, and perhaps that could influence his use of patches of colors there. He was also a big fan of Monticelli, and he loved the way that Monticelli used thick, luxurious layers of paint on his canvases. He was inspired by Bernard and his use of a thick black line outlining these flat planes of colors, similar with Cézanne and Gauguin. And in addition, Will points out that Van Gogh would have been aware of the work of the engravings of Gustave Doré, who shows these, and on the right we see Dante and Virgil meeting the lustful, and we see this swirling S-shaped curve of lovers that are being damned to hell, and you can see those swirling lines in Van Gogh's night sky. And on the left, there is the Empyrean, where God, as a circle of light, is surrounded by concentric circles of angels. And you can see very clearly the inspiration here in his stars. So in short, the Starry Night was brought into existence because it was the perfect storm of body, circumstances, and world. And I think when you walk through the exhibit today, you can clearly see all his influences and inspirations there, and it's really a beautiful way of understanding Van Gogh's mind. Now, before we finish up, I just want to ask you all to ask yourselves a question as you walk through the exhibit today. What do you think? Do you feel that Van Gogh was an immaterial soul that was divinely gifted with artistic genius? Do you feel that he was a brain that was genetically predetermined to become a great artist? Or do you feel that he was a world of experience brought together relative to his body? Or perhaps you may think something else. Because the truth is, nobody knows the answers to these questions. Nobody knows the answers to this question. No philosopher, no neuroscientist, no physicist, no computer programmer or psychologist. And so therefore, your own answer to this question is equally valid and useful. And I think this question is more than just an interesting intellectual discussion. This question actually has really important real-world impact in the world we live in today. And I'd like to just give you a little bit more information about what I do every day. So as I said, I work in a neuroscience laboratory at a pharmaceutical company where our goal is to create treatments and cures for serious neurological diseases, diseases that kill children and steal the memories of our parents and aging relatives, friends. And recently, the field has developed this incredible new technology where we can take skin cells, for example, from a patient with a genetic neurological disease, and we can turn those cells into neurons in the lab. And then we can take those neurons and we can grow them in a certain way so that they form aggregates of these aggregates of cells. And inside those aggregates are many different cell types. There are many different kinds of neurons in the brain, and not all diseases affect all different kinds of neurons. And the cells, once they're in this aggregated form, they can exchange electrical impulses with each other. And so this is an incredibly useful tool, because you can imagine we can't really ask a patient for a sample of their brain to study, right? So we have to resort to animal models or other cell models, which are not really as accurate as an actual human neuron. But recently, there's been this paper that was published that says complex oscillatory waves emerging from cortical organoids model early human brain development. So I should say these aggregates are often called brain organoids or mini brains. And what this paper is claiming is that the electrical signals that they've seen in these organoids are mimicking an actual developing brain. So this question of whether we are a brain or are something else becomes really important, right? Because if you believe that you're your brain, then you might feel concerned about this work. And not surprisingly, there was an article published a couple of weeks later, and this is recently, this is just last month, October 20th, where the author says, scientists may have crossed the ethical line in growing human brains, and debate is needed over research with potential for something to suffer. So if you believe that you are identical with your brain, you might have some issues with this research. On the other hand, I should say these structures right now, they're really light years away from the complex structure of a full-grown brain. They're really just aggregates of cells. But the idea, the principle is there. And so if you believe, though, that that the brain has no internal content, and that all of everything you think, everything you experience comes from the external world, then you might not worry about this, as long as those structures don't have any way of sensing the external world, that there's no possible way that they could be thinking, because what would they be thinking about? They have never seen anything, they've never heard anything or felt anything. And this is really important, because the diseases that we're trying to treat here where I work, the diseases that the people that those occur in definitely are conscious, are thinking, and are suffering. So, these are very important tools. And with that, so I've talked a lot today about what other people think, and I just want to do one slide just to put in my own 2 cents here. So I do agree with John Locke. I don't think there's any innate content in our brains. So in my opinion, as long as those organoids have no eyes or ears or ways of sensing the world, they're not thinking. And I think that the evidence for that is really just the very simple evidence that people who are born blind, who have never seen light and never experienced colors or anything like that, they do not dream in color. They have no concept of what an experience of light or color or vision would be like, because they've never experienced it. I do also agree with Riccardo Manzotti that existence is relative. I don't believe anything exists absolutely. I believe that in order to exist, you need to cause an effect on something or be measured by something else. However, I'm not sure that I'm 100% ready to commit to identifying myself strictly with the matter that's inside a brain or strictly with the matter that is outside in the world. And because my feeling is that I am a scientist, so I do believe in the physical nature of the universe, and I don't believe in supernatural things. I believe that we can learn everything we need to know through looking at the physical world. But I'm not sure that physical actually entails being material. And we've talked about several of these concepts today. For example, velocity. Velocity is a thing. We know it's there. We can measure it. It exists. However, it is not identical with the trolley. And gravity. Gravity certainly keeps us all here on Earth, but it is not identical with the Earth. Chemical reactions are processes that occur. They create changes in the world, but their reaction is not identical either with the reactants or the products. Light is very clearly not a material thing, and yet it is essential for everything on this planet to survive. Also space. It's there, it curves, it responds to gravity, and yet it is not made of matter. And one other point I'd like to make as well is that all of these non-material physical things require something to be relative to. The trolley requires the cart. The Earth requires some other body which has mass for you to be able to measure the gravity. Light is actually a result of a change in relation between an electron and a nucleus. And I'm not a cosmologist, but space seems sort of a difficult concept to get your mind around without two things in it to measure how much of it there is. And so I don't have any answers, but I am bringing up the questions. And with that, I'd like to leave on a quote from Albert Einstein, who said, "The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing." And I'd like to thank Will South and Riccardo Manzotti for their ideas and support, and the Columbia Museum of Art for having me here today, as well as my father, Ron Viani, who's an engineer, who just loves discussing physics with me, and my two friends, Ira and Vlad, who are artists and gave some feedback on the artistic content. So thank you all.